Hello, Internet. Gino, that Pinguino Greco here again with another episode of Deep Listens. I am joined, as always, by Spooky Billy Rothert.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for listening to the Silent Hill 4 podcast. Happy to be here, as always. Looking forward to talking about a good game that's in a great series. I'm not sure how this game measures up to the rest, but we'll get into all that.
We certainly will, and we are also joined, as always, by PhD on the come-up, Peter Womb with a View Busby.
Whoa.
That's a strong one. That's really strong.
Oh.
Welcome, everybody. Glad to sort of dip my toes in the survival horror waters, unless you count BioShock, which is, not very survival horror-y.
I'd call more than like a suspense thriller, maybe?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
I feel like if you are very capable of killing the things that are hunting you, it somehow crosses a threshold because survival is not that hard.
All right. Well, semantics aside then, this is probably my first survival horror game, so glad to jump in.
Yeah, so Silent Hill 4. Once again, if you want to get in touch with the show, go ahead at Deep Listens Pod on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We have comment sections, and deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. Feedback, all that stuff. So, Silent Hill 4. Billy, why don't you set us up?
Oh, God. All right, so this game, Silent Hill, you can't really talk about Silent Hill or any one of its particular games without talking a little bit about the Silent Hill universe. Usually, you start off with like a very vanilla character who is placed into or happens upon a scenario where there's some kind of haunting or possession or some kind of supernatural setting in the world, and must figure out a way to resolve that issue or survive it and escape, and some kind of spooky stuff happens along the way. Well, in Silent Hill,
I would say like the setup is usually there is some sort of blank slate cipher sort of person who is drawn to Silent Hill, which is this scary town kind of in the northeast of the United States. It is some fictional place in the northeast. Think like Salem, Massachusetts, or something like that. And it is unclear why they were drawn there, but Silent Hill is this place that is full of fog, it is full of monsters, and generally speaking, as you play the games, you are as much unraveling the character who you are playing as you are learning stuff about the town. It plays in that kind of psychological horror space.
Definitely. So what makes Silent Hill 4 kind of different is that we're not actually in Silent Hill. So the game opens up with a character who we name Henry Townsend, who is just your regular guy who moves into this apartment in a town called Ashfield. Basically, the only story we get is that there's an opening cutscene where the game describes Henry Townsend moves into this apartment. He's living a happy, normal, boring life. And then he starts having these weird nightmares, and they occur over a period of 5 days. And oh, by the way, he can't leave his apartment. That's kind of the whole setup for the story so far. That's like the very first 5 minutes of the game cutscene. You then start traversing through multiple little areas of his apartment that open up as little dimensions to these supernatural worlds, where you must start experiencing a series of murders that you eventually have to get to the bottom of. Your sort of impetus for exploring these worlds is finding out what's going on, how are these murders connected. You meet a couple of minor characters, you see them come to the ends of their lives in some sort of way. All the while you're traveling back to your apartment, aka this is sort of why the game's called Silent Hill for the room. You're sort of stuck here as the hub. So all the while you're trying to figure out what's going on with these murders, what's happening in my room, and how do I resolve this. That's sort of the impetus of the game, what is starting you off in most of these scenarios.
Yeah, and one of the other interesting things about Silent Hill 4 is that it uses the first person on top of the different story elements. So most Silent Hill games are purely third-person camera perspective, where you're running around Silent Hill as a location. Generally speaking, also, they have tank controls where you're kind of holding a button to make a character move forward in whatever direction they're facing, where there's a static camera kind of looking from an angle. So it's a weird kind of control scheme. This game, when you're in the apartment, you're in the first-person perspective. A little bit weird first-person shooter kind of controls, but that's generally how you're interacting with the world. And so you are kind of moving around his apartment, investigating different places, and kind of getting a sense of what it's like to be in Harry's apartment in a level that, exploring when you're in these kind of weird alternate worlds, it goes to regular Silent Hill third-person controls, and not controls, but third-person perspective, and you don't necessarily get that sense of place the way you do in the apartment. So it was an interesting mechanical departure on top of an interesting story departure.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll talk more about the apartment, sort of what it's doing, but sort of just elaborating on your point about a sense of place, it gives that to the apartment that a third-person perspective might not necessarily be. It's a question of embedding, basically. In that first-person perspective, it's embedding you within that apartment. That becomes, it's sort of trite to say a character in its own right, but that's pretty much what happens.
It's at least an object of the story more than just a setting. It's being acted upon, and like people are acting because of the interactions of the apartment. It's more than just a setting. It's become like an artifact in the story.
Yeah, and it also acts upon you in some ways that are really interesting. I think that the apartment, for as much as the first-person apartment stuff can be a little wonky as you play through the game, I think it's also the game's strongest suit, is when you're in the apartment. The moments between sojourns to these alternate worlds, when you're kind of getting your bearings in your apartment, I found to be both the most terrifying and the most calming simultaneously. It's this weird play where the apartment is the only place you can save, and it's the only place where you gain health just by being there, at least for most of the game. And so you kind of want to stay in this place, but also there's weird stuff happening, and the apartment, as you play through the game, becomes more and more unsettling. And so I think that it has this really nice effect where you're coming to appreciate the space and like it as it is starting to do you harm. There's a nice play.
It's playing with the idea of sanctuary, right? That we all sort of have these spaces within which we expect to be comfortable, to be safe, typically our homes and whatever. And it's playing with that relationship between person and personal space, that idea of sanctuary.
Yeah. And so when the game starts off, you're in this first-person perspective, and you're in the apartment, and eventually, you're trapped there. When Billy mentioned that you're trapped, there are chains on the door that prevent you from leaving at all. Mm-hmm. And eventually a hole opens up in your bathroom after you investigate a little bit, and it's this gigantic hole that you crawl through, and when you crawl through it, you end up kind of taken away to another world. And as soon as you get to that other world, it is a third-person perspective. You have a weapon. There are monsters. There are threats to be dealt with. There are other characters you actually interact with. And so it's two very different places where you're very isolated in the apartment, other than some notes here or there and bits of radio that you can hear. The third-person perspective stuff, when you go to the other worlds, is very much like Silent Hill, except you're not generally in Silent Hill. So the environments are pretty different from what you would expect.
So one thing that I noticed is a really important departure from this game is that these are basically levels in a hub world. And in like Silent Hill 1 and 2, for example, you have, I wouldn't want to call it a sandbox world because it still is compartmentalized. But for example, in Silent Hill 1, you might go into a building and that's where the world is. And maybe go to another part of the town and to another building and that's where the world is. But here it feels more like a Mario level system.
Yeah, and that was something that I really needed to get used to playing this game, having only played Silent Hill 1 previously, that there isn't this sense of a larger interconnected world. Instead, you're just going through the hole and you end up wherever you end up. And then once you go wherever you're going, those levels are also a lot more constrained than what you would expect in like a Silent Hill level. And
it's basically a Silent Hill Mario pipe
Almost. Yeah, I mean, it's a hole in the wall. And you do get a pipe.
Yeah?
That's true.
But once you start moving between these different levels, you start to notice, hey, monsters can't follow me between rooms. And some of these rooms are pretty small. So running away means something very different when all you have to do is run from one door to another, versus in something like Silent Hill, when you are moving throughout the city itself, or the town, I guess. When you're running away, you have to run for blocks, and you might not know where you're going. Whereas in these levels, they tend to be so much more self-contained and so small and sparse that you know, okay, here's a door, and if I get to a door where there's no monsters, I'm safe in here. And it makes the game a little bit less terrifying when you know that escape is that close.
Yeah, I mean, the movement is sort of to balance that idea that you're sort of talking about of sort of being lost in this larger sandbox world with the claustrophobia almost. Like you're trapped with these threats of the smaller world. The problem is, like you said, you're not trapped. So it's sort of going for an atmosphere of claustrophobia, but one in which all the areas are split by these seemingly impenetrable doors.
Yeah. And in other areas, or like in other Silent Hill games, a lot of the times, combat is inevitable, and you sort of have to fight to get to your objective, or else something's going to chase you down. In this game, I think that's not true as much, because there's very few parts of the Silent Hill 4 where you have to kill the enemies that are in that room. Most of the time you can avoid them. It's only, I mean, I think the only example where I had to kill something was when it's like character model was kind of like too big for me to like just walk around it. So I had to kill it so I could just walk past it. Otherwise I could have just outrun the thing.
Yeah, so when you need to outrun stuff, another thing to mention is that in Silent Hill 4, you don't have a stamina meter. In the other Silent Hill games, if you run too many times, then you eventually kind of run into... Your character starts breathing heavily, and you stop being able to really get away. Whereas in this game, you can run... It seems like you can run forever. Maybe it's just because screen transitions are so frequent. And I think that this might just be a function of how high the graphical fidelity is in this game. Like, a lot of the character models are pretty high poly, and the different rooms are fairly well rendered. And I don't know if that's just a memory constraint, and that's why all of these levels are so small. Like, one of the funny things about Silent Hill, the game, is that it's kind of a product of a technological limitation. On the PlayStation 1, to render a game with as many large character models and different environments as they do, they needed to put fog there so that they weren't rendering so much stuff at once that the game would just run terribly. So that's why Silent Hill is so foggy, and so why it has that aesthetic that it does. In this game, it seems like because they didn't opt to be in Silent Hill, they had to artificially just make all of these tiny little diorama rooms. There are some rooms that are bigger, and so I'm not sure if it's actually if that is the real constraint. But when I was running around like the forest or the subway, I thought that might be the issue, that it's just too big. These rooms are too detailed. But then you start getting to places like the water prison, and those levels were fairly huge. So it might just be a design decision. Like, we want these levels to be small and tight. It's a weird decision, though, because I found that these small rooms made running a lot easier. It made me less inclined to fight, and it made me just honestly less afraid in a lot of those levels.
There's no real sense of pursuit. Like, I've never really played the Silent Hill games, but I know, at least from the incredible films based on said games, that in 2 there's at least like Pyramid Head. So like there's at least some sort of almost hard deity hunting you, or at least he's sort of indifferent, but you get what I mean. Is that the same case in 1? Is there sort of a greater sense of pursuit almost, that you're being hunted, being followed?
In 1, you get this cool mechanic. Well, it's kind of in all the Silent Hill games, but one of the most defining things is like the sound that happens. So even if you don't see any enemies on screen in Silent Hill 1, you get like the radio and stuff. So there's like this thing attached to your hip, and it'll play static when enemies are close. So if you're in the regular like town of Silent Hill, you're just running around. Maybe you don't see any enemies on screen, but you also have to hear the static, and you'll know, oh man, something's close. So there's always like an unseen imminent threat. Maybe it's not a, like like a paradigm of this is like the enemy type you're fighting, but it's pretty common in Silent Hill to have the protagonist be in some way endangered by something over and over again.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that this game loses is you don't have a flashlight and you don't have a radio, and without the radio, you don't have this oppressive... The thing with the radio is it creates this oppressive sense of dread, even if the monster you're going to be dealing with isn't that scary. Because the radio static is such an unpleasant noise, and sometimes the monster that's there is a real threat, that just hearing that static makes you slightly uneasy.
You get like a Pavlovian association.
Yeah, and in Silent Hill 4, there is a little bit of audio trickery when monsters are near. There are some distortions that happen, and it kind of lets you know, oh crap, monsters are around, but it's not the same. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just that the sound design behind the radio static, just piggybacks on something in your head as someone who lives in the real world that says, hey, this static is kind of horrifying, whereas what they're playing around with in Silent Hill 4 just isn't quite as Pavlovian. I don't know what it is, but it's not as terrifying.
So in its predecessors, the other Silent Hill games 1, 2, and 3, you do have things like playing with light, playing with sound, and in this case it was a radio. In Silent Hill 4, those things still kind of exist, but they're not used in the same way, and I think it takes a little bit away from the core mechanic of a Silent Hill game. I'm thinking about some Silent Hill 2 moments where you have this sort of flashlight pinned to your chest, and all you get to see of the world is the little cone of flashlight in front of you, and that created a huge a huge feeling of suspense. And oh man, if I turn around this corner, I don't know what I'm gonna see. Likewise, the radio that you get in the earlier Silent Hill games or some other tool that says, here's when enemies are nearby, here's where your sanity, it's supposed to be like a metaphor of your sanity going away when you get close to these monsters. And we kind of get stuff like that in Silent Hill 4 when the music changes, but it's really just an outside of the game music change. But Henry will sort of like clutch his head and it's like, I'm getting a headache or something like that. You can see the implications that the horror or nightmare realm has on Henry, our protagonist. But I think that taking away what's that like word in film where it's like the stuff that's in the scene, mise en scène? Yeah, mise en scène. It's like because there's no actual radio and there's no actual flashlight on him, those are things that really only the player gets to observe. So it's a disconnect that I don't like about this particular game, where I thought it was a success of the earlier games in Silent Hill series.
Yeah. And one of the other problems, I guess it's not necessarily a problem, one of the differences in this game is that you have a lot of different weapons to use and different item types. So in earlier Silent Hill games, you have your inventory, but there's no limit on your inventory slots. If you are hoarding weapons or items, they're not going to go away because you've filled up Henry's James Sunderland's pockets. With Henry, you have I think 10 item slots that you can have on you.
It's like 10 or 12.
Yeah, it's not a lot, and you can have that many items on you at any given time. In your apartment, there's a trunk that you can hide items in, and that has infinite storage space. But that means that at any given time when you're going into the messed up world, the fucked up-agon, you know that you need to bring some of the weapons you need to survive, different key items that you might need to interact with the world, but you also want to leave enough spaces to pick up items that you find that are useful. And so I found that for me, that led to a playstyle where either I was just using items to free up slots rather than whether I thought they were useful or necessary, or I was leaving stuff behind kind of hoping that I wouldn't need it and then would have to go back to get stuff that I ended up needing. So it creates this circumstance where the right way to play, at least from what I could tell, is frequently going back to your apartment whenever you were near capacity, or anywhere at all near capacity on items, and just constantly ferreting stuff away like a squirrel, and just hiding them in your chest. Not chest.
Ferreting like a squirrel.
Ferreting like a squirrel, yeah.
Yes.
Excellent
Like a
metaphor.
Ferreting
The one
like
that
a squirrel.
got me the most was the ammunition.
Yep.
Why separate each block of 12 to a separate inventory item?
I think it's supposed to be one box of bullets, and you can't put more in the box. But
Yeah, it's dumb.
you can't stack
Yeah, it
them.
is dumb.
And
They stack in your box though, right?
yes,
Yeah.
they stack in the box, or in your
In your
supply
trunk,
closet.
like in your
Yeah.
in your storage container.
But that meant that there were just some items that So in the second half of this game, it's important to mention, all of a sudden healing becomes a real problem. Your apartment stops being a safe place, a place where from half of the game you get fully healed by just being in your apartment, and you basically don't need healing items because whenever you need to head back, there aren't really bosses in Silent Hill 4. There aren't a lot of monsters that can really do a number on you, surprisingly. So you don't necessarily need to be carrying around healing items. You can just leave those safely in your apartment because whenever you need to chill, there are ample portals back to your apartment, and so you're just kind of fine. Later on in the game, once your apartment loses that natural healing property, all of a sudden, if you didn't save healing items, you're just kind of screwed. Because the game's going to give you more later on, but you really need to look for them. All of a sudden, you need to spend more and more time in the fucked up world and actually have to deal with these different monsters instead of just running past them, because you can't just count on the fact that when you get back to your apartment, everything's going to be okay. And so early on the game, I made the mistake of using some of these items when I thought it was appropriate, because I thought that I was on a roll. Like I was in this sense of flow in the kind of, what do you want to call them? The messed up worlds, the alternate realities that you go to.
Yeah, it's good enough.
I was in the middle of a puzzle, or I had just beaten a tough enemy, or I had just met a character. And so I wanted to stay in that world. But my inventory was full, or near full. And in this game, then that means you have to find a portal, leave, go back to your apartment, go through a few different loading screens, probably save, like put stuff in your chest, walk around your apartment to the portal back to wherever you came from, go back there, and then you're back where you need to be. But this whole process takes a couple of minutes every time you do it.
And it breaks the flow a lot.
And I just found that pacing problem really made me not want to play the quote-unquote right way. And so when the time came for me to actually use all those items that I needed to have been hoarding, they weren't there. And so the game just became really unpleasant. So
for me, just like the player I am, whenever I find something that I can exploit, I'll just exploit the shit out of it. A really good example is when I played Castlevania, I think it was Symphony of the Moon. Did that one have the cards?
Is that Symphony of the Night, you mean? Or
Symphony of the Night. Whichever one had like the little cards you would combine together to create different attributes. There was one that would just slowly heal you over time, and I would just turn that thing on in a safe place, get up and leave, and like come back and just be fully healed whenever I wanted to. Like I had no problem just exploiting that thing. And I would do that with the apartment as well. I didn't care about breaking the flow of the momentum as much, so I'd say, great, I have a bunch of consumable items. I'm like 2/3 low on health, and I've gotten to a decent spot. I'm just going to run back and just completely heal and dump all my stuff. And I was an item hoarder, but I like to play that way. I think that this game could have been entirely fixed if one change was made. Or sorry, not entirely fixed. I mean, this part that we're sort of talking about, this inventory and breaking the flow, fixed if they just did one thing. If they had put a separate unlimited inventory for your key items. Like, I'm fine with them limiting how many consumables you can have, your bullets, your health, your weapons. I'm fine with them with us having to space manage those things. But the key items are what kind of bugged me, was that you could have put something in your chest that you didn't really understand what it was for, and then, oh shit, you need it. And so if you didn't bring that specific item with you and have it take up one of your few valuable inventory slots, you couldn't progress without it. So I wish that this game would have had a separate inventory, or like a hidden inventory for your key items that didn't take up your slots. Other games that have done stuff like this, for example, is like Devil May Cry games. You do have not inventory slots, but you have consumable items, but then totally separate is your key items that you might have to pick up anytime to complete a level. And having or not having those key items, you're only limited by if you picked them up or not. You don't have to store them or make them take up an inventory slot. I think if they had just given us no problem holding all of our key items and only have to manage our consumables, this would have been totally better.
Yeah, and
it's
go ahead, Pete.
briefly, it's a problem that's compounded by the fact that you have to constantly pick up tiny little bullshit slips of paper so you can slide them under your door later.
Yeah, we have infinite inventory for the journal and stuff. Why couldn't they have just given us infinite inventory for our key items, things that we need to progress the story?
Yeah, and the one thing that I think is a saving grace of the item system is there are some times where they do very clever things with the idea of the apartment as a separate location from the alternate realities. Like, for example, there's a key at one point you get that if you carry it into a certain screen, you're just trapped in that screen. You can't advance. But you can take that key, go back to your apartment, put the key into your chest, go back into the alternate reality, and then you can advance, and kind of you're passing that key to yourself around kind of this barrier. And there are moments like that that I think are really cool. I just wish that, like you said, I think you can do that and still not have this larger issue about hoarding and inventory space. I think that some of the cool, because it is one of the cool things about this game that you've got this secondary place that you're kind of returning to. But I think it's more of a headache than it's worth sometimes. Like, I don't know, I got this doll that someone gave me. Is this going to be a useful key item somewhere down the line? No, don't pick up the doll. Never take the doll. Nothing good happens when you take the doll. But this doll, I'm keeping it in my inventory because maybe it's going to be a puzzle solution later. I don't know, someone gave it to me at the beginning of this level, and then, that means if I run into a healing item, I can't pick it up. And, well, that healing item was in a room with a shitty ghost or something, and I don't want to go back in that room to get it, now that I've sorted out my inventory problem.
Can I ask, all right, so one of the key sort of enemies in this game is sort of floating ghost victims, right?
Yes.
They're basically immortal.
They're hilarious.
They are hilarious. That's my point. Is there something that's inherently less scary about a floating enemy versus one that sort of like walks or skitters?
Shambling.
Yeah, to my mind, floating is just an inherently less scary means of locomotion.
It might be. I think it's just the way they float, because they don't really float at you with a purpose or
they kind of just
anything.
bump around.
Yeah.
Meander a little bit.
Yeah, they move like I would imagine a balloon moving in a room full of fans.
Yeah, basically.
Fair, sure.
It's basically the plastic bag from American Beauty, but it lowers your health and sometimes grabs you and makes
I
noises.
was thinking more like if you ever see like an old laundromat and they just kind of like have these like hooks that slide around and you shoot down the line.
Yeah,
it's kind of like they just kind of slide at like a fixed elevation and just sort of like scoot around the room.
But
and sometimes they just miss you.
It's extra funny in the few rooms where they can float higher, because if you're like going upstairs and they're trying to chase you, sometimes they just are too slow and they can't keep up with you. And
yeah,
that's
you
always
just
funny.
go from the other side.
Yeah, so the ghosts for me, I guess we can talk a little bit about the enemies. There are like dogs and weird monkey men.
Except they make cat noises.
And they make
Some
cat.
sort of
They're weird.
floor tentacles.
Yeah, there's wall
Floor
people.
tentacles are good.
The floor
yeah.
tentacles suck. They look like wavy tube men. They don't scare me at all. There's the two kids. There's the twin victims, which are like a giant.
This weird like hand crawler thing.
Yeah, scary doll faces. And then there's like shitty nurses. And I think that's almost all of the enemies in the entire game. There's nothing.
Yeah, there's
and dogs.
Ghost wheelchairs, but they don't show
Yeah,
up.
the wheelchairs. Not as bad as wheel skeletons from Dark Souls, but
They're spooky.
If you want to talk about some real nightmare fuel, talk about the wheel skeletons from Dark Souls.
No, thank you. But I found a lot of the regular enemy types to be fine. Like, they're fine. They weren't especially scary. Like, the monkey noises that the monkey dudes made me laugh more than it made me
They were ridiculous.
scared.
They were ridiculous.
Like, the dogs didn't scare me because their patterns are pretty quick to learn and you can outrun them.
Almost every enemy can just be outmaneuvered.
Yeah.
I want to actually talk about the combat a little bit. I mean, we talk about the enemies too, but the combat's what I want to get to.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a quick thing about the ghosts. I thought that the ghosts themselves, when they use the ghosts in tight spaces, like apartment rooms or train cars, stuff like that, where you are all of a sudden trapped with this ghost, and ghosts are the only enemy type in the game where just being adjacent to them damages you. They don't have to touch you. They have like some shitty aura that deals damage just by you being around them. And so when you're trapped in a room that is tight and hard to maneuver, you can't like go through the ghosts. You need to get around them. Otherwise they will do like a physical attack that does way more damage. And so the game feels very claustrophobic in those handful of times when you're trapped with a ghost and you really have to interact with it. The problem is they deploy ghosts way too liberally, and there are places where they're not terrifying at all. Like, it's a very big space with stairs, and they just can't keep up with you, and it's just kind of funny. So I wish that they would have just been a little bit more diplomatic in how they used the ghost enemies, because I feel like there's something there that works. It's just they didn't constrain their use to only when they work.
I wish they had more than 5 enemy types. They also have the bats, I guess.
Are they bats?
Things. Bats or crows or whatever. Doesn't matter.
There's some sort of bug. It sounded like they buzzed.
They do buzz. They're weird. But you hit them with a pipe and they just go splat.
Combat in this game, there's the weird
slugs.
Yeah, there's the weird slugs. So, staying true to Silent Hill games, you have limited weapons, limited combat efficacy, and it almost incentivizes the player to avoid combat. In many Silent Hill games, including this one, most of the time, running from enemies is just straight up better. Just do not avoid the fight. Your character can just move better than they can. So as long as you're good at controlling your character, with or without tank controls, like in some Silent Hill games, if you can outmaneuver them, there's no reason to fight anything. They never ever give drops unless it's like a key, like a key enemy that you're basically told, hey, fight this thing to get its medallion or something, or whatever it is.
Some of the monkey dudes in this game have golf clubs that you can take from them.
Oh yeah, that's kind of weird.
Is there a
driver?
I wonder
if they have different. Do they have different combat skills? Like, if you hit somebody with a driver, is it going to do more damage than the putter?
I don't know, but I think aren't they all have durability, right? They're not all invincible. Yeah. So some weapons are invincible weapons, like they cannot break. Some weapons are durability weapons. You can use them for a while, but they will break. They have some benefits, like I think the golf clubs have pretty good range. Like, they have decent reach and decent animations and stuff. But they actually don't do very much damage in comparison to like the axe or the, some other weapons that.
The baseball bat is solid.
Yeah. What I wanted to talk about primarily was the use of stances in a game that really had no business having stances.
Like combat stances? Like martial arts stances, you mean?
Like, when I think about stances, it better be restricted to like a fucking like Bloody Roar or like some bullshit 2003 fighting game, right? That's where I need stances to live and die. Okay? Now, this game makes you press a button to get in battle mode. So you have to hold R2 and then you're allowed to swing your stick. Now, what I thought, like, this actually got me so frustrated that I looked up other games that were made at or before this same time period that were sort of action combat games, and I'm thinking, like, Jesus, there's like Ninja Gaiden, there's all the bunch of the Metal Gear Solid games. Kingdom Hearts came out before this.
The greatest game of all time.
Yeah, right? So, like, how many games just have like a free flow running through a world combat series that has only just like one button? And this game had to have like a 2.5 button series weapon.
I don't know that it's so. These games kind of have a legacy of having bad combat as a way to disincentivize you from fighting. Yeah. That's at least a reason that people give for why this game's combat is shitty. And that is something that I can agree with to a point, but I also think, hey, you can make the enemies scary or make combat ineffectual in ways other than you feel terrible when you're trying to fight. Like, it's hard and unwieldy to control. And that's kind of where I lie on this game, is that there are ways to make combat scary other than having that toggle. And to be fair, the toggle does more than just put you in whack people mode. It also orients you to enemies like a Z
Yes, it
targeting
does.
system. And
That's kind of good.
it's kind of Z targeting, but it also in Ocarina of Time, can you swing your sword if you're not Z targeting?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So it'd be nice if you could do that.
I mean, think about actually. Okay, I mentioned it before, kind of as a joke, but think about a Dark Souls game. Sometimes targeting is actually worse for your weapon than being able to free swing it. Like if you're able to say, "Oh, if I stand at this angle, I have better frames on this, offensive maneuver." Like maybe the lead pipe, you just had to be angled the right way, and it was like one of the best weapons that could just cheese out some boss. You really didn't get to explore that. A lot of times you were constrained to a very one-dimensional combat system that had basic animations at best. One thing that it did add was I think this was the first Silent Hill game to have a charge attack. I think none of the other games gave you charge attacks.
I didn't use
it was
it
really
'cause it's
it was
bad.
really good. It made some enemies kind of trivial because if you did have to fight an enemy, there was a few times where you were basically forced into combat. But if you could get into stance mode and just charge it up and take 2 steps from you're out of range of their combat to now you're in range and you get the first hit off, they're just instantly dead. So having a charge attack was pretty good.
While
Yeah,
we're discussing,
Oh, go ahead. Gene.
all right. While we're discussing combat, can we point out that your female co-op character, the only or at least primary weapon she can wield is her purse? Whereas, like, granted, she has a broken arm, can't swing a bat, but you have a gun. She can shoot a gun with one arm.
You can find her a riding crop.
Oh,
Eventually,
yeah, much better.
and a chain.
Better.
So yeah, it's not great. It's not super great. You can't
Yeah,
even
2
give
out of
her...
3 of those weapons are just either pathetic or like sexualizing.
You can also... You have a knife. You could give her a knife.
Give
She
her a
could probably
knife.
make
She
it
can
work.
stab.
She could stab real good, probably.
That time when you have to 2-hand your knife, I feel like you're not. I feel like you're not going to need that time.
And it's not like the hatchet is like this heavy. She could probably swing a hatchet one-handed. It's a
Henry
small
uses it
hatchet.
one-handed.
Yeah.
Henry uses all of his weapons one-handed, unless he charges them.
Yeah, so I don't know if we should count this in story. I'll talk about this when we talk about story stuff. But there's more kind of sexist bullshit in this game that, other than that. But one other thing I guess I should mention with the combat is when you change weapons, I think you press like square to pull up your items menu, and then
Select.
select to pull
I think
up the
it's
items
select
menu
and then you square to equip it.
to equip stuff. When you're in lock-on mode, I'm not sure if you can accidentally change weapons or something like that. I think that isn't square also the attack button?
No, X is the
X
attack
is the
button.
attack button. Okay.
Yeah, I think you cannot accidentally swap weapons.
Okay.
I mean, I never did.
I thought that the combat stance also stopped you from changing items, so that was a good reason. Like, hey, you've got these items, but you're not going to accidentally use them by pressing X when you're in combat mode, because you need that to attack. Is square the equip, or is X the equip when you have the items menu pulled up?
Square.
It is square, right? Okay, then. Yeah, the
Square
combat
lets
stance
you
sucks.
equip and use items.
Okay.
So, like, if you walk up to an area where you have to use one of your key items, you use square on it.
Yeah.
And that's also to equip items, and then X is any other like normal interaction in the world, like open a door or pick up an item, and X is swing your weapon in combat stance.
Okay.
So I think we've just broken down every possible reason to have combat stance. Bottom line is, it doesn't destroy this entire game, but it definitely was just a big drawback.
Yep, and one other mechanical thing that I feel like we should talk about before we get to the story stuff is once your apartment stops being healing, it kind of takes on this dark tone, and you know as soon as that swap happens that your apartment's something's up. And over time, you will start to have hauntings in your apartment, different just environmental objects that are starting to become possessed. When that happens, there are a couple of items you need to use. There are holy candles and like saints medallions that can de-haunt or decursify your purge, cleanse, that can cleanse your apartment. And as soon as that happens, the management stuff kicks up a whole nother level. Like, I mentioned how bad kind of running back and putting stuff into your chest just to make sure you have enough items is, but also it adds this additional layer where you have to run back to make sure, oh crap, my window was jiggling too much. I better put a candle in front of it so that it gets exercised. And it becomes this weird upkeep management thing. It's almost like pulling weeds in Animal Crossing, except they're haunted windows or, haunted clocks. And it makes your room super dangerous if you don't do that, because those haunted items have the same aura as ghosts, and if you get near them for too long, you will get damaged. And if you stand near them for way too long, you just die, and it goes to straight game over.
So I'm gonna nominate that for best analogy when Game of the Year comes. The Silent Hill 4 apartment spookings to Animal Crossing weeds is going to be just pre-nominated right now for best analogy Gino drew in 2016.
Yeah, it's just I'm torn because I think it's one of the coolest things that the game does is when the apartment starts getting more and more fucked up. It makes the apartment, this space that used to be your sanctuary, something really legitimately horrifying. Like, some of the stuff that happens when your apartment is haunted is terrifying, and it's some of the strongest stuff this game does. And because, in the first-person perspective, I don't know if we mentioned this, but you don't have access to weapons. You can't enter a combat stance. You are purely navigating this space. And so when you're dealing with these different hauntings, you're almost powerless if you don't have a candle or a medallion. There's no punching your way out of a problem, which is something you can do in every other circumstance, like when you're in the alternate worlds. And so you're really vulnerable in your apartment all of a sudden where you were once invincible. And so it makes me wish that you didn't have to go through this process of finding items to de-haunt things. Like, I wish that they just went all the way with it. And the hauntings actually play into the multiple endings of this game. And so they really commodify your ability to get rid of those hauntings and make it really worth your while if you want to get the good ending to do that. However, when you're taking care of your apartment and making sure it's de-haunted and, you're vacuuming the carpet and you're dusting the shelves, when you're doing that stuff, it's less effective of a horror game than if you let your apartment go to shit. So I feel like they've got this weird tension that they've created between playing the game the right way, quote unquote, to get the best ending, and playing the game in the way it is most terrifying and effective as a horror game, which is a real shame, because one of the things that got me to stop. So I did not finish this game. I got about halfway through. When we'll talk about it in the story, but when the moment happens. But one of the things that made me want to stop playing was I knew that I couldn't take care of my apartment. Like, I had missed items and left stuff behind that I needed to take care of it, and it was starting to upset me. Like, I was starting to have nightmares and stuff about the apartment space. Like, I live in a kind of old house with a kind of old apartment, and seeing all those things out of the corner of your eye that you think aren't, it seems innocuous until all of a sudden you start losing health. There's a haunting where your shoes are haunted in Silent Hill 4, and the shoes, they're just in a place they shouldn't be, and that causes you to start losing health. And I thought that, oh crap, that's something I could see happening in my apartment, and it started freaking me out a little bit. But it's a shame that they give you this, like, you have to set this little candle aside, and then all of a sudden everything's taken care of as soon as the candle burns down. Did you guys have an issue with that mechanic too, or?
Specifically talking about the room and the hauntings thereof, it was a direct intent of the developers to take a room as being what people normally consider a safe place and turn it into a nightmare zone. So if there's been some stuff written about the game, there is a quote that I'll I'll read. It says,
If you could attribute it to, that'd be great.
yeah, I want to get the person right. So maybe Pete, you had a thought too. I'll try to see if I can get this quote.
Yeah, my main problem with this is sort of the same thing Gino articulated. Not so much the mechanic itself as the commodification of it as a means of sort of achieving this like great ending. You know what I mean? Because then it becomes, all right, have I hit all the ghosts? And then it becomes just, it's less of a horror mechanic, and now it's a checklist. You know, it's your errands, it's your chores for the day. And I think that's, as Gino astutely put it, that's basically what undermines this whole mechanic from the first piece.
Yeah, as soon as it stops being a horrifying haunting and starts being Weeds and Animal Crossing, you're fucked. Like, the mechanic has lost a lot of its metaphorical weight, unfortunately, and symbolic weight.
So, I found the quote. It was an article written by a guy named Kristen Reed. And in the article it says, if you create a series and have to come up with something new every time, it says, if you create the series, you ought to come up with something new every time. We wanted to have a dramatic change this time. The room should be the safest part of your world. What if that changes to nightmares? So normally, taking a step outside of the game for a second, most of the time when people are playing games, they're in their house, their room, whatever it is, and you think that this is a safe place. Just like when you're watching a scary movie, as soon as you turn on the lights in your living room and realize that everything's not so spooky anymore, things kind of go back to the way they were. But in this game, the safe place slowly but very sure, and you see it happening, turns into a nightmare realm, and you're not safe anymore. And just like it happened to Gino, they're pretty sterile things, or pretty normal apartment or room things, like a window or a bookshelf or a TV or your shoes. And once those things turn into horrors, that can be unsettling, and it was designed to be that way. Maybe in Gino's case, you took it worse because maybe your apartment, and I've been in your apartment, so it's not identical to Henry Townsend's, but I could definitely see how you could get spooked in your place, because it's actually, it is kind of similar. My shitty little apartment is just too small and hilarious to draw analogies between Silent Hill 4 and my life, so it really didn't bother me that much.
Yeah, weirdly enough, when you live in like 100-year-old former church apartment, and you live in the former priest's quarters, you get a slightly different vibe. Yeah, the rectory. One thing I just wanted to mention about the apartment before we move on to story stuff is that you can look out the windows in the apartment, and there are a couple of different ports into the regular world. There are the windows that let you see kind of out onto the main street of Ashfield. There's a peephole that you can look out to kind of see who's in front of your door, and then you eventually get a peephole that shows you into the room next door. And each of those things kind of adds to your sense of being trapped in what is an otherwise normal world. Like, in your room is this really terrifying, fucked up happening, but if you look out the window, it's just people going about their normal lives like nothing's going on. And I found that dichotomy was extra unsettling. And especially when you look out the window and sometimes you see things going on in the apartments next door that are kind of you don't know if something's wrong with the world around you, or if it's just, you interpreting something wrong. Like, I looked out the window and I saw a dude like rolling around on his floor. At least that's what I thought I saw. And there's this weird sense of voyeurism where it's like, oh, is that guy doing yoga or doing something like that? Or is everything possessed and fucked up and a nightmare world?
Those are the only two options. He's either doing yoga or the world's coming to an end.
Now, did you guys look out the door peephole frequently?
Yes.
So did we ever get a good explanation for what seemed to be all those bloody handprints on the wall?
Yeah, there's one for every person who's been killed.
Yeah, it's a tally system.
Yeah, but are the other people
seeing that?
Some of the other characters seeing that?
No.
Oh, okay. That makes a lot. That makes a lot more sense. Okay, so there are sometimes I couldn't discern what was seeable to only Henry and only the player, or what was sort of nightmare world, because I guess what I thought about the game was when you look out your peephole, you're looking. That's like one of the only times you can look outside of your like Nightmare Zone. And when you look out the window, you're seeing outside of the Nightmare Zone. When you look through the peephole into the room next door, you're actually seeing outside of the Nightmare Zone, but you can't get there. But when they had stuff like the handprints on the hallway outside your door, that sort of was like breaking the rules that it has sort of established, and said, "Oh, you're looking into a place that should be reality, but just kidding. There's this like one more thing that's still you being in Nightmare World in the outside." Like, I didn't think any of the stuff that I saw out the window was part of Nightmare World.
Yeah, and it really plays with that idea of what is reality to Henry, and what is reality, in Ashfield. Like, is this apartment building, is there something larger wrong with the apartment building? Is it just wrong with Henry's room? Is something wrong with Henry and not anything at all wrong with the apartment building? But when you start looking out the peephole and seeing things like people trying to unlock your door and the key doesn't work, or like trying to pass things under your door and the thing they passed under it is very different than what you find under the door, you start to question whether there is a larger problem going on with the world itself, or if it's just contained to Henry's situation. And I thought that was pretty artfully done, honestly, with the way they meld that stuff.
And the voyeurism, I think, is just as, if not more interesting when you think about it in reverse. As in, sort of, all these people are perpetuating their lives outside with sort of no idea what's happening in Henry's room, right? Because you think about, like, when you have situations where it's, serial killers, or even where they find sort of bodies that have been in rooms for a while, all the neighbors are always like, "Oh man, we had no idea. We just thought this was sort of like a normal person." And it's sort of the same idea that all these people, not only can Henry see the real world out there, but nobody outside can see what's happening within Henry's apartment. And it goes from sort of sanctuary to something more akin to a prison cell.
Yeah, and the few times you see people trying to interact with Henry's room and try to see what the heck's going on there, they can't bring themselves to understand the full magnitude of what's wrong. Like, they think that they're going to be able to unlock the door and go inside and, "Oh, Henry, he hasn't been here. He just locked his door and then left out the window or something." Or, "Oh, we've been hearing some strange sounds. Maybe he's up to something. I don't know." But it's like, no, I'm locked in here. There are weird trains. There's a hole in my wall that leads to other places. Please
Another
help.
dimension?
Help.
Yeah, worst case is like a meth lab, not like a whole nother Nightmare World.
Yeah, and so they're talking about it like, "Man, have you heard anything from him in a while?" "Nah, whatever."
He's probably
I've got
fine.
stuff to do.
And so the escalating sense of dread among your fellow apartment mates is pretty interesting to see.
What's the deal with the other hole, though?
Which other hole?
So you have the hole that leads to the Nightmare Realm, and then on your other like wall by the kitchen, there's just another hole where you can see, I guess, his neighbor through. Is that like the whole deal?
Yeah, you can see Eileen's room, and
Okay,
that lets you see kind of what's going on with her life. There are parts where you really want to make sure she's okay, and so you'll want to look and check in on her, but it also lets you kind of stay up to date on what's going on in her life. Like, sometimes she's just getting ready for a party or watching a scary movie.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of this sense of normalcy that you don't get to have that I thought was interesting. And it also does there's like a rabbit stuffed animal in there, and I'm like, it's facing away from you at first, and I'm like, you don't put a rabbit in there that's facing away from you unless it's going to look at you and stare at you in the future. You don't put a weird stuffed animal in a room. That's Chekhov's stuffed animal. It's going to stare at you at some point and do something creepy.
Okay. Wow. I can't think of anything mechanical or intro. Do you guys want to start breaking apart this roller coaster?
The story makes no sense.
Oh, okay. All right. I have made a lot of sense of this story, but please correct me if I start saying it's not quite right, because I have probably read about 8 different explanations of what's going on here to try to buffer myself into it as well. So, to its namesake, Silent Hill for the Room is actually about the room itself. We alluded to it a little bit earlier, that something is happening in Henry's apartment. We find out that it's more than just a setting. This is some kind of evolving artifact. I mean, I think that's the best word that I can use for it, is that something is happening with this room itself. We get stories about another character. So let's name some of the really important characters. We've got Henry himself, we've got Eileen, who seems to be more than just a supporting character. We're not really sure what her connection is yet until you get later.
Your next door neighbor.
Yeah, she's your next door neighbors, but we get some. The story tells us a couple of times where we're meant to care for this person more than just supporting character number 4. You know, like we're supposed to care about Eileen a little bit more. A couple other names get dropped. You've got names for some other supporting characters, but we also get one important character. His name is Walter Sullivan. Walter Sullivan is connected to actual town of Silent Hill and some murders that occurred there. So bring it back to Henry. Henry's in this room, and before Henry lived in this room, some other reporter from Silent Hill lived in that room who was Joseph
Schreiber.
Yeah, Joseph Schreiber lived in that room. Schreiber was looking into the Sullivan case about the Silent Hill murders, about Sullivan himself, and trying to see that, you know, some stuff doesn't quite seem right. What's going on here? Sullivan starts to experience, sorry, not Sullivan, Joseph starts to experience weird shit. Then Joseph disappears. We don't know what happened to this guy. We get remnants of his story from clippings that we find in our apartment in Nightmare Realm and like diaries of his and stuff. But it's all focused on this Walter Sullivan character who was a serial killer from Silent Hill. As we progress through these levels, there's like, 5 or 6 different levels, and then we have to repeat them in nightmare mode. We meet different victims. We find out that there's this big ritual going on, this big grand narrative that Walter Sullivan's character has to have a certain number of people killed in a specific way to make something happen. But like that's just a fucking lot right now. Okay, so
yeah, so early on when you first start the game, you find different diary there are these red pages, these red diary pages that are scattered throughout your room. They'll come under your door at different parts of the game. You'll find actually I think they all come from either under your door or you find them in different parts of your apartment.
Yes.
And those red pages kind of tell you the overarching story of Joseph kind of unraveling the Silent Hill
Walter
cult.
Sullivan case, yeah.
And it takes as canon the Silent Hill cult stuff that you'll learn in like Silent Hill 1 and 2 and 3, where Silent Hill, on top of being a spooky-ass place, has this weird cult that believes in this dark demon god thing, and they worship it, and because of their dark rituals, they create this nightmare version of Silent Hill, where if you get drawn in there, you're kind of dead but not dead, and there's this alternate reality between... There are like 3 levels of reality. There's like Silent Hill that everyone in the real world sees, and then there's this weird foggy Silent Hill, and then there's Nightmare Silent Hill where like the walls are made of flesh and all sorts of weird shit. So in this game, it takes that for granted, and Joseph kind of investigates all this stuff. So very early on, you hear about the 21 Sacraments, which is some sort of ritual that the Silent Hill cult believes in. And over time, you start learning about what the heck that could mean for Walter and for the rest of the story. But at first, you just, a portal opens up, you go in there, and you meet a character named Cynthia Velasquez.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the first people you meet.
What a miserable portrayal.
Of just anything? Of a human being?
Yeah, just like a reprehensible picture of who a person might be, could be, whatever.
I'm going to do, if you get me out of this subway, I'll do something for you.
Special favor.
It's the worst.
Oh
Her character is terrible, but you meet her, she's in the subway. You can actually look out the window and see her go down into the subway before you enter the first level. And you find her, you try to kind of help her for a while, and she ends up, one way or another, she will end up dead by the end of that level. You then go back, you learn a little bit more about the 21 Sacraments. You go back into the hole. That leads you to a forest where you find a person named Jasper Gine, who's a kid who's like obsessed with the occult. And in this forest, it's actually on the outskirts of Silent Hill, and there is a orphanage called, I think, like
no, Wish House.
Wish House, yes.
Called Wish House.
And at Wish House, you learn that this is basically an orphanage run by the Silent Hill cult, and it's run for the purposes of like raising kids for their rituals and stuff.
Bad shit happens. It's not a place you want to be as a 9-year-old.
And you learn that Walter Sullivan was born or was raised there and kind of raised within the cult.
Right. So the Walter Sullivan story kind of goes like this. Connects it to room 302, which is Henry's apartment. Walter Sullivan's character was born in that apartment, and his parents abandoned him. So baby Walter was just left in that apartment. He was taken to the hospital and then, quote unquote, adopted, taken in through the goodness of their heart by Wish House. Wish House then, interfered with Walter's development, saying things like, we're going to take you back to your mother. We're going to show you your mother. And they take him to room 302. This implants the idea in his mind that the room itself is his mother. So baby child Walter gets this impression that the room itself is his mother. Young Walter starts taking daily, like ritual-like trips to the room, not being able to get in, but just showing up at this random apartment over and over again, until eventually Walter finds out that he was tricked. This is into his teen years. Grows up to become a I don't want to say crazy, but mentally compromised person due to his traumatic past, and finds more about this cult. And he finds out that there's a ritual he can perform, which requires 21 murders, or as he would call them, sacraments, and bring his mother back, or let him meet his mother. And it's all tied to this room. So that's sort of the big second piece of this story. There is the Henry bit, there's the Joseph bit, there's the room, we don't know what it is, but it's really all about Walter and him trying to reconnect with his mother, which is either the room itself or what he appears, or maybe the room will let him visit his mom, whatever. But it's this kid who had a really fucked up childhood, and the room was his birthplace and also his kind of mother figure. Yeah. God, did I miss anything? This is
that's the
story.
large story, but you also you meet Jasper in the forest. You go to a water prison, which is kind of this torture chamber for kids, and there you meet Andrew DeSalvo, who is a kind of an old Italian dude who gets murdered.
Well, the prison, interestingly enough, it's a panopticon. So it's a prison that's set up so there's a single station in the middle from which you can look out on all the rooms. Not particularly relevant to the story, but very relevant to Foucault's philosophy. So I bring it up.
And that location is probably the most horrifying location in the whole game, I think. It's probably the most effective.
Yeah. The first time you visit it.
Yeah. And so there's that one. You then go to, after the water prison, is the apartment. You go back to your apartment. You basically you're in an apartment complex across the way. You're in a hotel. You can actually see out your window and see the building you're running around in, the hell version of. In there, you meet Richard Braintree, who's one of your neighbors, and he gets killed. So every single one of these levels ends in a murder of the human character you meet. Before eventually the last level, or the second to last new level, is your apartment building, where you find Eileen kind of attacked. And once you get to your apartment building, you meet Walter, or a version of Walter. You meet multiple versions of Walter, because there's two versions of him. There's a little kid version of Walter, and then a full adult murderer version. And the murderer version, once you start meeting him, he'll show up in your apartment. Like if you look through the
door peephole?
Yeah, the peephole in the door. You can actually see him looking in your apartment as a grown man, and that's kind of terrifying. And that's when I say, the game starts blurring what is real and what is not, because he starts showing up outside of your room when he's very clearly he's dead. Like he's actually dead in terms of when Henry's living in the apartment. He's supposed to be dead at least.
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be like he is the haunting.
Yeah.
But there is also someone that's actually committing these murders. So,
well, I think he draws people into his little alternate world and then kills them there.
And
so
if you
these
die
people
in the
are
dream.
Yeah. Well, Joseph, the character who lived in the apartment before us, thought that Walter was actually alive. There was story points in like if you found enough pieces of the story that was sort of piecing together. He says that Walter allegedly died in prison, but he thinks that someone else, or maybe it wasn't Walter who was actually caught at all. But there was this character that would keep showing up at room 302, Henry's apartment, over and over again, and he thinks that person was the real Walter. So Joseph thinks that Walter's actually alive and in fact not dead. And so that, if that is true, then that would say, okay, yes, there are people that are being actually killed in the real world, because in each of these 5 worlds you go to, these 5 worlds that are linked to your apartment, you meet a character in each of them. All of them have a real world, outside of Henry's nightmare. They have a real world attempt on their life. And all of them succeed until you get to Eileen's, who you sort of like barely save, and she becomes your companion character.
Yeah, and after the apartment building, she gets attacked, but then she becomes an escort mission for the rest of the game, basically. You go to her hospital, you rescue her from the room, and from that point on, Eileen is at your side. You can give her weapons to equip. Even when she is equipped with a weapon, it stays in your inventory.
That sucks.
Damn it. Which sucks. But
bad inventory.
Also, she is hobbled because she's been attacked and barely survived, like an actual attempt on her life. So she moves slowly. She doesn't attack well. She has health. Ladders. She can't use ladders, and she has health. Which
you can't see her health, though.
She can't die, but if she takes enough damage, she will become gradually more possessed. And when she gets maximum possessed, she will start dealing damage to you like a ghost. Until she kind of like snaps herself out of it. But that means that you are greatly incentivized to protect her, to stay close to her at all times, to not leave her, to go to your apartment that often, to make sure that you don't leave her behind. Because if she is too far away from you when you change screens, you will leave her behind in whatever location you ditched her in. And she will stay there until you come back.
Yeah. Side note, there's sometimes you can cheese that out and kind of make it work for your benefit. Like, there's some rooms where, yeah, it's a pain to drag her around, and you want to get to this one particular door, like objective door. If you go into like a side objective door and leave her and come back, she'll like rubber band to you sometimes, and that can be nice. It's kind of unreliable, but there's some times where you can sort of like cheeky, like actually leave her behind, but then make her shoot up next to you.
Yeah, and that was something that you shouldn't have to do. And
you're right.
maybe it's just because it's a PS2 game and they hadn't figured out AI, like partner AI yet. But having 50% of your game, because it is 50% or more of the game, where you have to run around with Eileen as your sidekick, and all of a sudden the encounters that were not difficult or even scary before are legitimately... You feel something, but it's not terror, it's frustration.
Yeah,
because
it's just annoyance.
There are times where Eileen just... if the ghosts or stuff were attacking her and I really had to protect her, that's one thing. But if she's just bouncing against a wall or clipping on a chair or something like that, and that's the reason why she's getting left behind or stuck or attacked, that's not scary anymore. And so that was something that I ran into constantly, was just as soon as Eileen joined my party. And that was the thing that actually... It was 2 things that made me leave the game. It was taking care of the apartment and Eileen. Because there were multiple times I just was walking through like a set of subway cars and she would get caught on a little door and then I'd have to double back and get her. Or, oh no, she's getting attacked by dogs. I need to go help her. And that's another thing where this character who could legitimately add to the horror or add to your sense of responsibility, it kind of leads to this inversion where all of a sudden your apartment becomes more oppressive, but the horrifying nightmare worlds become less oppressive because you actually have another human being there, and all of a sudden you have
more frustrating.
Yeah, you have real contact with another person, and that kind of reorients your sense of safety. But again, her overall health is tied into what ending you get. The more messed up she is, when there's the final boss fight, she walks, because she's possessed. She walks towards this like death
Death
pit.
pool. Yeah, death pit.
It's like a death gyro.
Yeah, and if the more possessed she is, the faster she walks to it, which means if you did a bad job of taking care of her, you are much more likely to get the bad endings. And I wish that her health was removed from that sort of mechanical weight, but it isn't. And so you're incentivized to protect her, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because if you don't protect her, you get the bad ending.
She sucks. I don't want to protect her.
One game that comes to mind is in the Shadow of the Colossus franchise, Ico's, one that came out before that. That game is actually 100% escort mission, and we have some of the same implications about protecting our sidekick. But that game actually has decent AI. It has better tandem interactions. Like there's no time that Eileen is there to help you. She's really just a package. Did like an interaction that like somehow progressed the game. You know, in a game like The Last of Us, where we also played, yeah, for a lot of the game, Ellie, when you're playing as Joel, is, you know, a package to carry. But at least you can like boost her up onto a ledge and she like gets you a ladder or something. None of that for Eileen. Yeah, her health is not explicit, so you don't have any indication of how well you're doing.
Well,
you just know
she gets more bloody. It's atmospheric. It's atmospheric health. It's like this weird atmospheric health system.
It can improve, but only over like time.
Yeah, and just a question: have we played a single game where there's an escort mission or like an escort character that wasn't female?
Can you? I
name one?
definitely haven't. I don't think I can name one.
Didn't we play? What wasn't there some male escort missions in Mass Effect? Wasn't there one to take some guy in the Citadel to another place?
I don't remember like a character though who's
man.
like a vulnerable character model. But I know that like
okay.
Ellie and Joel, sometimes Ellie will get snatched, and you as Joel need to free her or help her. There are times she's not like a full-on escort mission, but she is another character you have to care about. I know that in Resident Evil 4, you have to protect the president's daughter, and that's got some escort mission stuff in it. I'm just trying to think literally, because I've seen a lot of these mechanics over time, and I can't name a single one where the guy is the person who's being, or a guy, like a guy escorting a guy.
Well, it can be a guy escorting a child. I guess what we can agree on, it's never a man escorting another adult man.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And that was just something that I noticed because the two women who you meet in this game, the game really asks you to be protective of them. Like Cynthia's like, "Oh, if you save me, I'll do a favor."
We go to
for
Bone
you."
Town.
Yeah. Or Eileen, who barely knows you, it seems like, is like, "Oh, you're my only hope, Henry." The other characters you meet, Richard, Jasper, and Andrew, they don't roll with you at any point.
No.
They just, you meet them. I didn't even know that they were people who were candidates to be murdered, because I thought they'd be like Cynthia, where the character would be like my sidekick or my ally for a little bit, or like I'd have to take care of them and kind of get to know them. But all the dudes just kind of go off on their own and then end up dead at the end. It's a weird dichotomy where they're this weird kind of sexist dichotomy that's happening throughout the game, which I guess isn't that surprising considering some of the stuff they do at the endings, but you know.
It's still annoying. I mean, it's just a macrocosm of the purse issue.
Yeah, and Pete, did you want to talk a little bit about the room, the apartment, and the different analogies and stuff?
Well, I mean, the game is with womb imagery. I mean, just first off, Walter thinks that the room is literally his mother. I don't know how he sort of made that leap, but okay, he's made it. And then, like, you literally go through a tunnel to escape the womb out into this sort of horrific real world. You need to find his umbilical cord at one point.
Yeah,
in
in
order to,
fact, they
use
reference
to
it in
kill
like
him.
the first scene of the game.
It
That was
stinks. And it stinks. His umbilical cord smells really bad. There's a scene that you can see if you look out the peephole where your superintendent's like, and the umbilical cord I have in my room started to smell real bad recently. And it's like, what the fuck?
And he's just like, oh no, never mind.
Eileen just like, what'd you just say?
Oh, don't worry about it.
I'm going to go get the keys to unlock this room. Yeah, that's what I need to do.
That was unreal. I can't believe they actually put that in the game. Like, that's like the first 10 minutes you could experience this scene of the superintendent saying, yeah, I've got this random umbilical cord in my room.
I keep it in a box.
It's smelling real bad recently. And so Pete, continue. That is definitely a birth reference.
Yeah, and they make you crawl through the tunnel the first time.
Yeah, every time you leave the room, it's basically a birthing for Henry into this sort of nightmare world. I mean, I think there's possibly a dissertation to be written, or it's probably already been written, about the use of sort of motherhood as a trope in horror games. Not even horror games, I should say, in horror genre. Like, you think, the first one that comes to my mind is Jason Voorhees. The whole thing is about his relationship with his mother. And I don't know what it is that makes us think motherhood is sort of not inherently terrifying, but sort of rife for this sort of horror turn.
Yeah, and maybe it's just the inherent sense of protectiveness that is supposed to be inherently there, that you can kind of play on this tension that this person will do anything to protect their child, their surrogate child, and so it adds additional tension to any circumstances involving them. But then there's also motherhood on the kind of the side of the attacker that I find just as disquieting, like that this kid is motivated, Walter is motivated to murder because of neglect, like not having the mother's touch. And maybe that's just Freud's fault.
Yeah, I mean, when you're looking for somebody to blame things on, Freud is a great option, pretty much 99% of the time.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of games where I can just say, is this Freud's fault? Is this why we've got this mechanic? And I think our episode on mental health and representation in games, I feel like really hit a lot of those questions. We got to actually ask an actual expert on that stuff. Yeah, the Kelly Dunlap episode.
Yeah.
Hey, is this actually psychology stuff, or is this just Freud? Is this Freud screwing around with us? Yeah, I don't know. Some of that motherhood, like the room being a mom, I thought was an interesting idea, but it's just kind of hokey in a way that I don't appreciate quite as much as just what is going on. The idea of using this room as a horror space, I love, but then when they try to tie it into the weird Silent Hill mythology is where it loses me.
Yeah, even like the idea of Henry being birthed into this nightmare world, it seems like it's tossed in just 'cause, like, ooh, like birthing, spooky. Like I don't even know. Like, is it body horror? Like, not really. But there's no sort of execution of the symbolism here beyond just the overt, like, tunnel, birth canal sort of idea.
Yeah, and the ghosts that when they kind of erupt into the world, they do so kind of in this weird flopping, birthing motion also, that I think is evocative, but not, not that cohesive as a metaphor. But on the whole, I like what they're going for. I just wish they executed it a little bit better. And if they didn't have to also juggle this cult supernatural angle and just committed to it being psychological in some way or something like that, or just committed to the cult thing and lost some of the psychological angles, I feel like maybe they could have gotten a more cohesive story. But because they're playing around with a lot of different, they've got a lot of balls in the air, so it's tough to bring everything home, especially when they're trying to be cryptic about it.
Yeah, they don't strike a good balance and concealing information.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little about how we get this information, what little information that we do get that is, actually, I'll take it back. We get a lot of information, but a lot of it's not useful. So I'll explain what I mean a little bit. This is very typical of a lot of Silent Hill games, is that the world is interactable. So this is kind of dipping back to the mechanics side, but where did I learn almost all of my Silent Hill 4 story points? From like pieces of paper or a book that I find or something written on a wall.
The Silent Hill Wikia is a pretty good place to learn all your story information.
YouTube videos.
So in Silent Hill, and 4 specifically, but in the other games too, you can interact with the environment. And as a completionist, as someone who looks for collectibles, I like that. But here I think is a really bad example, and I don't want to be completionist and collectible-y about this. So, surprising as it may, my grindy collectible mind is not turned on by this game at all. I want there to be interactables in the environment, and I want there to be bits of story that I can get, but I think this is the farthest from what I actually want. So, an example. If you're walking through any of these levels in the Silent Hill 4 universe, or any Silent Hill game actually, it goes for all of them. You come across lots of doors. Some of them you can interact with, but all they say is, this door is shut, and I'm pretty sure it will never open.
And then he scribbles it out on his map. He's like, nope, fuck this door.
Never be opened.
Or
it's impenetrable.
He'll say, man, these bars sure look rusty. That's it. Like, that's all you get.
This is an axe-proof door.
All of the guns in this room are fake. Like, he'll just say something weird, and you can interact with the environment around you, but in the least rewarding, least relevant. Like, I'd rather not be there. I'd rather just not be there. So in the apartment, for example, you can talk to just about any object. You say, hey, this is my bookshelf. These books sure are dusty. Or go to the sink and he'll say, I don't feel like washing my hands. Or he'll go to his shoes and say, I don't need these right now.
I'm going to push back on that just because as the apartment gets more and more fucked up, the things he will say when he references things changes pretty dramatically. So when you start out, his apartment is actually decorated with a lot of pictures of Silent Hill that I guess he took on a vacation there, which is a weird fucking place to vacation.
Yeah, right. That's a great spot.
And so he vacations there and he takes all these pictures. And as you look at these pictures at first, it's like, it was such a beautiful day. It was like sunny. That lake, Toluca Lake, is beautiful this time of year. Oh, that lighthouse is so picturesque. And over time, it's like, can I see this horrible orphanage in this picture of Toluca Lake? Can I see where I am when I'm in that weird forest world? I guess I heard that there's some cult stuff going on in Silent Hill, but in this picture, it seems so peaceful. And until you start getting to where it's darker and darker, and as like the game is going on, your apartment gets visually darker and darker. And things start happening in it, like things a fan collapses into your table and all sorts of other stuff. Things start turning on and off when you're not interacting with them. But the pictures start saying, I get an eerie feeling from this picture. I don't want to look at it anymore. Or this is starting to make me feel weird. So and I think that it compounds in this nice way where it starts out inviting and really non-threatening. And over time, if you keep interacting with those items, they start becoming sinister in a way that I think is effective.
Now, I have to concede on the apartment specifically. Now, every other area of the world in each of these levels, you're going to interact with useless objects. I'm going to draw a contrast with a game like BioShock. That world can be pretty lifeless if you want it to be. Two things that we find in Silent Hill and in BioShock are, they're executed kind of differently, but it's you just like find text in the world. It's going to either be like a piece of paper, or it'll be like a recording box like it is in BioShock, one of these little tape cassette players or whatever. Now in BioShock, that is a hidden thing that is missable in the game. You could miss it, But in Silent Hill, some of these things are mandatory. Like you have to start reading the things that come in under your door to make some things trigger back in the nightmare worlds. So you get progression. And then in Silent Hill, these things are like right in your face, and that's the story that you get. And so the most critical story that you find comes from you finding these pieces of paper or finding these clippings or pages of a book, whatever it is. And I would have preferred if I got my story enhanced by looking for hidden things, not having Silent Hill say, oh great, you're looking for hidden stuff, here's a bunch of useless text on the screen.
Well, yeah, and some of it is just like, hey, here's this cabinet that looks like it's full of medical things. Maybe some of it's medicine that can heal me? And Henry will be like, I don't know what any of this stuff is. I guess I can't pick it up. And that's just to let you know that even though it's something that might be explorable, you'll never get something from it. And it's boilerplate text that just lets you know what's really interactable and what isn't. And they actually do something pretty subtle with Henry's head, where he will kind of lock eyes on something if it's interactable, and if it's not, he will not do that. So if there's a gun, like bullets in the room, he'll just stare at the bullets as you walk by them.
If they're real interactables?
Yeah. He will lock eyes with it. Same thing with enemies. His head will angle towards things that are actually useful.
They did that in Legend of Zelda: The
Final
Wind Waker.
Fantasy IX.
A little bit.
They did it in Final Fantasy IX.
In Wind Waker, an actual good game from that time period.
They did it years earlier in a great game called Final Fantasy IX.
Is that different than the Final Fantasy IX that we played? Is that a different game? Or?
I'm pretty sure it is, Pete. Let's not get him confused. Anyway, back to Silent Hill.
Is it pronounced Fafix? I was pronouncing it Fafix.
Fafix 9?
Fafix? No, just Fafix. F-F-I-X. Fafix.
Ah, Fafix. Yep.
Back to
in
Tommy
colloquial
Wiseau's
Japanese, that's how they pronounce it.
Back to Tommy Wiseau's Silent Hill 4 at the room. So, what is this whole story about? Like, we're not going to relapse the whole thing, but
Walter killing some fools to make his room detached from reality and become this hellscape.
You've got some options at the end of the game, four different endings, and there's really only one boss fight. It's the final boss. Oh well, there's like boss rooms, kind of
tapestries, but that's about it.
Yeah, I was thinking about those. Anyway, so you have a boss to fight. Got some information on how to make the fight easier, and the game doesn't tell you explicitly, but there's different outcomes for how quickly or how well you've played the game so far. So you get this dialogue and this, really weird dialogue from Walter when you finally meet his ghost form or human form in the nightmare, whatever it is. And he tells Henry, hey man, you are the 21st body I'm going to need. You're going to be the one that finishes this whole thing. So let's do it right here, right now. We knew, and we figured out, from earlier in the game that Eileen was number 20. Plan, but now that Eileen is possessed and sort of in the final boss, she's like possessed and walking towards her death. You have to beat the final boss. You have to beat the final boss fast enough before she murders herself by walking into this death trap, in order to get the good ending. And then you have to have kept your fucking incense candles up in your apartment good enough so that it's not spooky by the end of the game too. So we find out that Walter has been doing all this and trying to birth or have this rebirth of his mother, and it's sort of explained.
That's some weird Freudian shit right there too.
Yeah, I don't even know. It's sort of explained in this one in this one text I have from the game, and it's something that you find probably 3/4 of the way through the game. And it's when you visit like nightmare version of room 302. So it says, and I'll read it from the game, and it's kind of hilarious and fucked up, but explains almost everything that's going on. So it goes like this. There was once a baby and a mother connected by a magical cord, but one day the cord was cut and the mother went to sleep. The baby was left all alone. All right, just hang on to that for a second. It gets better. But the baby lots of friends at Wish House, and everyone was very nice to him, and the baby was happy. His friends told him how to wake up his mother. So the baby went right away to wake her up. But the mother did not wake up. No matter how he tried, she wouldn't wake up. Because, this is where it gets good, guys. Because the one thing that he was trying to wake up was the devil. The baby had been deceived.
What?
Poor baby. Right, this is apparently some sort of dialogue in like Walter's picture book or diary or something. So we find out, this is the second half of this excerpt, is, hold on, I want to make sure where I left off. All right, so it says further, the baby cried and cried when he thought of the mother. He remembered the feeling of connected her through the magical cord. Just then, a ray of light came down from the sky. The light was warm and made the baby feel good. When the baby looked into his hand, he saw the magical cord was lying there. With the cord clutched in his hands, the baby went happily to sleep. All right, end scene. That, first of all, how obvious do you have to make everything? Like, I mean, Jesus. It was so, one, badly written, I think badly delivered, and hilarious. But then, it basically just sort of spoils everything of Walter's past. We knew that he was some kid who got disconnected from his mom. It tells you about Wish House. It tells you about why back to the room. It tells you how to beat the final boss, which is you need to go get that fucking umbilical cord and kill him with it. Like, it literally says in part of the scripture of how this cult works that you need to go get a piece of the mother and put it back into the body of the one who's like doing the sacraments if you want to stop it. Like, it tells you, like, it's just I don't even want to talk about it anymore. It's just the fucking worst.
It's weird because the game tells you what's going on like 7 different times in 7 different cryptic ways. It's like, oh, here's a parchment from Silent Hill where it's like, oh, here's how you perform the ritual if you wanted to perform it. I don't know, whatever. And then there'll be like an article from Joseph.
Maybe you're bored on Wednesday.
Yeah, maybe you want to kill 21 people and cause the devil to rise. Here's Joseph's article. I think that someone's trying to perform this sort of ritual. I don't know, but I think it involves killing 21 people. Walter Sullivan seems to be involved. Up here's an article from, your local investigative journalist who also has something on this. Up here's a biography of a person from Silent Hill who also mentions this thing. And by the end of it, you're just like, yeah, I get it. Walter's doing some shit. These people are dead because of him. He's the person behind all of this, and it's to resurrect the room. I found this umbilical cord in the room, and I don't know. It's stinking recently. Something's up. I don't know. Something's up.
Like, as opposed to all this non-smelling umbilical cords. Like, hey, I have all the normal umbilical cords. They're fine. But I have this one extra one.
Now, slight defense of the game, some of that stuff is missable. So if they want the characters to learn this, it's probably good that they gave us more than one opportunity to find it, but Jesus.
You find it so many times. If you are paying attention, you find the story so many times. And, like, one of the very first things you find in your room is, like, in the corner you find a red piece of paper, and it explains, like, the 21 sacraments of Silent Hill or something. It explains something about a ritual. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's what's happening, huh? That's it. Before you even go through the first tunnel, it's like, yeah, that's what's up.
You just understand the whole game.
That's it. You got it.
Weird chains on my door. Something's up. Don't go outside. Walter. Oh, I wonder if that's the Walter. The one that murdered all the people. It's not super subtle, but one thing I wanted to mention about the ending. So there's 4 endings. You've got one where you save Eileen, and then you and Eileen, if you have protected Eileen and saved her in the final boss battle and also kept your room clean.
That's the 2 things. Like, does Eileen live or die, and did you keep your room clean? It makes a Punnett square of, like, the 4 possible endings.
Yes. And your Punnett square, if you get the good room, good Eileen Punnett square, then you and Eileen survives.
Yeah, she lives.
She, like, wakes up somewhere.
In a hospital.
And she's okay.
You bring her some flowers.
Yep, you bring her some flowers, and she joins. She's like, let's leave here. Let's go find a new place to live.
Yeah, let's move in together.
you saved me in that nightmare hellscape by giving me a purse and a frickin'
A riding crop.
a riding crop.
The riding
You
crop's
seem to
going to circle
respect.
back around.
You respect women, so let's go live together. Then, if you do a bad job with your room but still save Eileen, she says, "Let's move back to the apartment."
What the fuck is she thinking? Like, what is her possible reasoning for that?
It also
'Cause
shows you the apartment is very fucked up afterwards.
Because she's still possessed or something. I don't know.
think,
It's
yeah.
calling you
Kind
back.
of like tempt him back. Okay, I guess that makes sense.
It's calling you back. So Silent Hill is supposed to be like it calls out to people.
Mhm.
It's something from the earlier games.
Like Cthulhu.
Like Cthulhu. If you save the apartment, the thing that matters, if you tend to your plants and all that stuff, then,
Rattling windows.
Yep, you clear that out, and Eileen still dies, then your apartment is okay. Like, you wake up in a clean, unhaunted apartment, but you hear on the radio that Eileen is dead, or she died from her wounds.
Yeah.
And then if you really fuck up and everything goes bad, then you get possessed by Walter or something.
Yeah, like
Like,
Walter
Walter
takes
dies.
over the apartment. And...
Yeah,
Yeah.
and he takes you over.
It's still Spoopy Town in your apartment, and Eileen is dead, and you're gone? Maybe not dead, but gone.
And you're gone, is what you said?
Yeah, like, it's not Henry anymore.
Yeah, so one thing that I want to mention about these endings, one, it's a shame that they have 4 endings, and depending on how quote-unquote well you play the game determines how good of an ending you get. Because I think that some of these endings are far more interesting than others in terms of actually telling a horror story. I would like hey, the room's still fucked up, and maybe you're getting drawn back in there. I think that that's a more compelling ending to a story than everything's okay, or, Eileen's dead, and we have to figure out what the hell's going on. Like, any of the, the middle Punnett squares, those are probably the more interesting ones than everything's terrible or everything's fine. So I find that the most interesting part of the Punnett square is the 2 side Punnett squares, the ones where you're kind of a little bit messed up, but it's not completely messed up, versus the completely fucked up or completely safe versions. And so I feel like if you're going to have this game where you're trying to tell this larger narrative, maybe commit to one of them instead of making mechanical excellence a prerequisite to you getting a particular ending. And also, go ahead, Pete. Did you want to?
Well, yeah, I was just going to ask, do you think, if we're looking at this as a reward for the player, right? Let's just assume they want to reward what, quote unquote, proper play. Do you think game players would feel rewarded by story integrity and story compellingness, or just sort of rewarded by that happy ending?
I think that rewarded by the happy ending is what people would actually enjoy. But as someone who enjoys a better story, I think that people might learn to appreciate the better storytelling endings if people leaned into them more and just had some authorial intent and said, hey, this is the ending, instead of saying, hey, here's a grab bag, or hey, here's the reward structure of how this is going to roll out. And it's just hard to know because for so long, a lot of games have leaned heavily into either player excellence or player choice being the governing factor of what ending you get, rather than narrative intent.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point, but I do think you're sort of playing with fire when you make sort of claims like, oh, well, you'll learn to enjoy this. I think it's what do I want to say? I think it's a noble goal, and I think we should value sort of story compellingness over that happy ending, but I do think it's not necessarily paternalistic, but it is sort of maybe highfalutin to suggest that, oh, you'll learn to like this.
Yeah, and I know it's snobbery, but it's hard to have these games where they are trying to tell a serious narrative. And you've talked about this before, about the inherent problem between player choice and narrative cohesiveness. And with something like this, where the player choice is not a contributing factor to this It's a contributing factor in some ways, but it is not a selling point. It is not something that is inherent to the design of Silent Hill 4. The multiple endings come as a result of you either playing the game well or playing the game poorly. And so I feel like when that is the driving factor, maybe err on the side of a cohesive narrative, because it's not like Mass Effect, where part of the reason a person buys this game is because they're going to live out their own space opera fantasy. This game is like, I'm in it for the Silent Hill atmosphere. I want to get some spooks. I want to hear about some weird cult shit, but I mostly want to get an atmospheric psychological horror experience. And so maybe lean into the ending that most feeds that instead of making it about skill.
Fair point. Fair point.
And one thing that also comes up with the multiple endings is if you beat the game enough times and enough different ways, you unlock different weapons and you unlock character costumes. So I believe if you beat the game 4 times, you can have Cynthia wear a lingerie outfit instead of...
phenomenal.
Yes. You can unlock a lingerie outfit for her, and she gets breast physics that she did not have before. And if you beat the game enough times, you can also unlock a nurse outfit for Eileen, and she will wear a nurse outfit. So, just in case you were wondering how seriously this game took its narrative and its integrity...
Can we officially bury the our game's art argument? I think like this has just decided it for us. Like clearly, they are not.
Turns out that Cynthia has a tattoo of a rabbit on her ass that you can see when she wears her lingerie. Yeah, so you can unlock a chainsaw, you can unlock other cool weapons, and that is another one where, like, that is not what this game is for, right? This game is supposed to be an atmospheric horror game. What does giving you a chainsaw have to do with making this a compelling horror experience?
It makes you part of the compelling horror experience. You become a chainsaw massacrer.
You are now Leatherface.
Yeah.
And, Cynthia... It just makes me question why people like these games when that is also a reward that is built into it. Like, are they way into, like, this weird paternalistic protection thing, and so they want these female characters to also be making you horny? Is that what they're also in it for?
They want to be both scared and aroused at all times.
At the same time? And I don't know if that means when she dies... So all the characters who you don't save die and become ghosts that haunt you. Does that mean that she's in lingerie when she haunts you?
When she like crawls on, it's her crawling under that subway grate, right?
Yeah, she becomes the Ring.
Yeah, like if she's in lingerie, then like, man, I'm really scared and turned on right now.
I don't know what's going on, but I got a boner and I'm sweating, but not the good sweat, like a bad sweat.
Fear sweat.
I don't know. Like, what am I supposed to take away from this? Like, Eileen now has breast jiggle in her cutscenes because she's in the sexy nurse outfit.
You're supposed to take away a serious sexual neurosis. That's what you're supposed to take away.
This is not... Okay, let me take a step back. This stuff is comedic, and it takes away a little bit from the seriousness of the Silent Hill universe. Yeah,
a little bit, just a little. This is that.
But it's not outside of the realm of Konami.
No, it's not, because this is also the game series that has the dog ending multiple times and the UFO ending.
Yeah, and there's a specific joke ending in this that there's like a no UFO end, whatever. Konami does weird stuff like this for multiple playthroughs, for whatever, and I think they can get away with it when it's not the first playthrough. If somebody plays through the game the first time and that's what their real gameplay experience is, and that's going to be what their biggest takeaway is, then fine. Subsequent playthroughs, which I'm a big fan of, giving you new stuff. Okay, yeah, sexy outfit is kind of lowbrow, but it's not intended to be the serious playthrough. Your second playthrough of a game should be something that you just do because you like the game so much, and oh hey, we can put Eileen in a sexy nurse outfit, and that's just kind of funny for the player who likes this game a lot. I'm going to defend that stuff more than I will...
There's no Henry Thong outfit. There's no G-string Henry.
Because Henry's uninteresting.
Yeah, but...
Maybe his ass is more interesting. We will never know.
Maybe he has a secret bunny tattoo. You're right.
It's just... On top of it being kind of distracting from the otherwise very deathly serious story that they want to tell. They tell it breathlessly throughout almost the entire game. It also adds to the sexism that's going on with the game kind of throughout. Like, Cynthia's not... It's not like she is this cartoonish character if you don't have her in lingerie.
It's not like she's like a legal aid. Like, oh, I'm trying to work my way through med school. Like, just, no.
No, she is either going to be insinuating that she wants to have some sort of sexual relationship with you in lingerie, or she's going to be doing it in her, like, regular outfit, which also isn't very...
Because... it's very revealing. Because it was a little too subtle the first time she did it. So, like, all right, we need to make sure the characters get it. Let's put her in lingerie. Then, like, Henry will know she's propositioning him.
Yeah, and if you wanted to just in case you weren't clear that they were presuming a male audience, a straight male audience, having the two female characters, and it's not like the two female leads, two of many, the two female characters in this game that aren't
all
ghosts.
two.
All two.
I guess the Room. Would the Room technically be a female character?
Maybe.
Just because it is a birthing pod doesn't mean that it's inherently female. Pete, come on.
Nice.
And then there's a
Just
ghost
trying to help
woman.
him out.
There's also a ghost woman who can attack you.
Yeah, fair.
But that's it. And they both have sexy lingerie outfits. It's weird.
We can talk about, a game that does this really well, and it's Devil May Cry. You get sexy Dante outfits and sexy Virgil outfits for beating the game. Hats off to them. That's how you do alternate costumes right. You give sexy protagonist costume.
Dante and Virgil are good-looking dudes. I don't think anyone's denying it.
Lady just sort of gets like a wetsuit, but it's actually less revealing than her original costume.
Like a schoolgirl. I mean, where are they gonna go from there?
So, like, games can do this right. All right, we're not going to bash on Silent Hill that much.
No, it's just weird. It's just, if you want to tell me this breathless story of a man who's in love with his room, and his umbilical cord's missing and all this stuff, and you want me to take it real seriously, then when I play it 4 times, come on now.
Don't include lingeries.
Come on.
All right, fair. Anything else about Silent Hill?
I would recommend watching it. I wouldn't necessarily recommend playing it.
I would recommend watching if you can I was trying to find one. I was trying to find like a good developer's commentary or something so I can get more out of it. But watch a really good playthrough, like not really a speed run, but like a really high quality playthrough. If we're gonna talk about this thing critically, like we do on our video game book club, is it like a watch, a rent, a pass? Like, I think you would maybe rent this game, don't pay money for it, but maybe watch a let's play of it. I would probably pass on this
There's something about moving around the apartment that I think still works. I just think every other part of it is dated in some serious ways. And it's mostly because no one's ever attempted something like the apartment since, at least that I know of. So it's just, I think that if you would take something away from this game, it is that apartment idea is excellent and carries an otherwise lackluster game.
Yeah, so just kind of going off that a little bit, there's a quote from one of the developers. What's his name? I've got it here. Hang tight. It's Masashi Tsuboyama is one of the devs who is quoted as saying, originally this development, referring to Silent Hill 4, was started from what we named Room 302 rather than Silent Hill. So the original concept wasn't from Silent Hill. Not to say that it didn't start off as a Silent Hill game. Like, it was that team, so they did the Silent Hill games. It was a Silent Hill developers game, but it wasn't born, like it didn't take its first development breath to be a Silent Hill game. So it makes sense that there was differences like this. I think the Room part was really good, Gino.
Yeah, I read a couple interviews a couple different interviews and statements that said this was meant to be a Silent Hill game, but they wanted to differentiate it from the rest of the series in terms of mechanics. So they always started with the Room as the concept, and then they kind of took that as, can we tweak what Silent Hill means Does it have to mean running around in this town, or can it mean something else? Does it mean the atmosphere and the supernatural stuff? And so they kind of ported the alternate reality stuff and lost the town, which I think worked.
Yeah.
The problem was just the execution. So with that, does anyone have any other parting thoughts on Silent Hill 4?
No, I think I don't regret my experience with Silent Hill, but I'd say it's definitely a pass for me.
Pete, you are
Pete's
muted.
I would just say,
There you go.
I would just say that if you want, I think Gino's right that the room stuff is well executed, but I think the move then is just to watch The Exterminating Angel. It's a surrealist movie where these people all go to a dinner party and they find themselves psychologically unable to leave said dinner party.
Oh,
There
no.
aren't locks on the door, there's locks on their mind. And I think it's a much better execution of this basic idea.
That's great. Okay. Might have to watch that movie then.
Yeah,
I
it's
would
from the
say-
1960s, but
I would
Sounds
say,
about right.
Pete, if you like, this was, I think, your first experience of the survival horror genre.
it was.
I would say Silent Hill 4 is not the best representation. Like, you shouldn't paint your whole experience with Silent Hill 4. Play Silent Hill 1 or 2 if you get a chance, and I think you'd see a lot more about what this genre has to offer.
All right.
I mean, we
Yeah,
also
good luck.
played, what is the name of that game? Until
Did we-
Dawn.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
with
but that game was,
the Wendigos.
horseshit teen
Wendigos.
horror movie. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, like a real survival horror genre, Gino.
that's fair.
Not that teen rom-com smut.
Yeah, maybe don't play this game and instead play Rosemary's Baby twice. Or
Yeah,
watch
yeah,
Rosemary's Baby twice.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you want to get in touch with the show about, Silent Hill 4 or something, go ahead at Deep Listens Pod on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We got comment sections, or deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. And without further ado, Pete, it is your turn to pick a game for us to play.
Yes, it is. So I'm going to pick a game that a few months ago released a new edition.
Ooh.
So, thank you. So I want to play Ori and the Blind Forest, the definitive edition.
Ooh, definitive.
Yep, the definitive one. So hopefully there's never another one, and we will, we'll be set after this.
Thank
Now-
goodness.
This makes me think about, like, is there going to be a final cut that's supposed to be, like, better than the director's cut, theatrical cut? I'm just feeling some Blade Runner vibes here.
Yeah, well, I mean, the
Publisher's cut.
movie ruined the book in the first place, but let's hope that's not the case for Ori.
I'm actually really hyped to play Ori and the Blind Forest. I'm going to be so hyped for this game.
I
Pete,
was
I feel like you've just been going through my Steam wish list and picking the game.
I asked him, what does Billy want to play? And that's how I make all my decisions in life.
God.
Like, how can I insert more collectibles into my English 202 class? Like, what can I do for my students that they can be a completionist in my course?
Man, I can't wait to play this game.
I just got to keep stepping up my quotient of picking weird games. Just weird bullshit.
No.
Someone has to.
No.
Someone has to.
Like, I didn't pick Madden, 20. Like,
That'd
this
be
isn't
great.
Madden.
I mean,
That's-
Ori and the Blind Forest is a legitimate pick. I'm just
Yeah.
saying I need to be picking even weirder shit. We're playing
I
Gallop
mean-
Racer.
If you're going to think about picking Madden, you made the first mistake of not picking NFL Blitz 98.
Good
Yes.
call. That's a
First
strong
mistake.
contender.
They hit
All
people
right.
after the play.
And they go,
They play-
good.
Edgy. It's what the NFL really is.
They play after the whistle. All right. So, till next time, thank you for listening. I guess we will be playing Ori and the Blind Forest. We'll get back into that 3D Metroidvania, or not 3D, some Metroidvania-esque platforming with Ori and the Blind Forest. Till next time, thank you, Billy.
Thanks everybody for listening. Silent Hill 4 was different in comparison to other Silent Hill games. Not necessarily bad, but I would pass. Like I said, give us some feedback. We haven't heard from you, sexy listeners, in a while. So look forward to next week talking about Ori and the Blind Forest.
Thank you, Pete.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. If we've learned anything today, it's make sure you save your umbilical cords. You never know when they're going to come in handy.
And thank you, listeners. Till next time, peace.